Hello and good evening. My name is Charlotte Potter-Kasich. I am the interim director here at the Barry Art Museum. Thanks for joining us this evening. We're here for the October 28th fall lecture. But first, let me give you a little background. The Barry Art Museum opened its doors in the fall of 2018. It houses the personal collection of Dick and Carolyn Barry. We have biennial rotating exhibitions, and we have lots of new acquisitions. The museum serves as one of the many cultural icons in Norfolk, Virginia, and sits at the gateway of Old Dominion University. I'm going to give you a little bit of a background about our collection, our exhibits, and our programs. Our permanent collection houses a remarkable assortment of maritime paintings, as well as American modernist paintings. We also have a remarkable collection of studio glass and contemporary glass, like this piece here by Monier from Armenian. Our collection often juxtaposes contemporary glass pieces with American modernist paintings in knowing ways that starts to show similarities between pattern, texture, and color. We also house a gallery dedicated to the art of dolls. We have historical dolls and automata. It's really one of the most fascinating components of our museum. Looking ahead, we have two changing exhibits that are currently on view. The first is Karen Lamont, Théâtre de la Mode. It's a remarkable show that shows a full retrospective of her nocturnal series, specifically juxtaposed with the historical dolls that influenced the work. Additionally, we have Waxing and Waning, which is a companion exhibit, and you'll be hearing from one of the exhibiting artists this evening. This was a show that was put together in conjunction with the Chrysler Museum of Art, the ODU Planetarium, and local collectors. We have a number of free public programs at the Barry Art Museum, including our weekly tours, audio tours, and multimedia tours. We have free 30-minute yoga classes you can find on our YouTube channel, and even at-home activities for you and your young ones if you're trying to stay busy mid-pandemic. But this evening, we're here to discuss where would we be without our moon? So this is a lecture that came to be because of the Museum of the Moon by Luke Jerram. It's an exhibition that we just had right here on campus. It was a beautiful 3-day festival that attracted about 13,000 people. It was incredible. And Hans-Peter Plag was one of the people on our exhibition advisory board who helped sort of shape some of the programming. And through conversations, he came up with this really fascinating question. It's really a quandary that we're going to muse about this evening. Where would we be without our moon? So I'm going to introduce our speakers tonight. Dr. Hans-Peter Plag is a known expert on societal and environmental sustainability, climate change, sea level rise, Earth system dynamics, solid Earth geophysics, and geodesy. He started as a carpenter and then studied mathematics and geophysics and obtained a PhD in natural sciences. He joined ODU in the June of 2013 as the co-director of the Climate Change and Sea Level Rise Initiative and professor of Ocean, Earth, and Atmospheric Sciences. He's the founding director of the Mitigation and Adaptation Research Institute, known as MARI, at ODU. He provides scientific advice on the causes of and adaptation to the modern global change. And he engages in community assessments of local to global risk associated with natural and anthropogenic hazards. He contributes to the Group on Earth Observations, as well as different initiatives with particular focus on Earth observations in support of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Next, I would like to introduce Peter Eudenbach. Peter uses sculpture, video, and curatorial projects to explore the relationship between function and absurdity with the goal of finding layered poetry in the juxtaposition of diverse artifacts. He's a recipient of the Virginia Museum of Fine Art Fellowship in 2007. Udenbach's work has been shown nationally and internationally in venues such as Exit Art in New York, in Germany, at the Taubman Museum, in Virginia, Redwood Library in Newport, Rhode Island, and the Hazley Institute of Contemporary Art in Charleston, just to name a few. He lives right here in Norfolk, Virginia, where he is the professor and chair of the ODU Art Department. Please join me in welcoming our speakers this evening. And if you guys could both turn on your screens, and unmute yourselves. That would be wonderful. Welcome, guys. Thank you for joining us. So to start, I think Hans has the presentation, and let's get started. This is going to be fun.
Yes, thank you very much, Charlotte, for the very nice introduction, and also for giving us the opportunity to do this experiment here today, because I think it is a kind of an experiment. I think most of you in the audience, you have seen this picture of our beautiful planet from the moon. But I think we are not thinking well enough about how special Earth is with having one moon. So what would it be? What would be the situation if Earth was without a moon? If Earth was alone in space, just traveling around the sun without having a companion? First of all, it is important to understand that Earth is very special because most planets have several moons or they have no moon. So Mercury and Venus have no moon. Mercury is too close to the sun to have a moon, and Venus, we are not sure. It may even be one of the theories is that Earth stole the moon from Venus, and we don't know exactly. Mars has 2 moons, but then when we go to the other planets, Jupiter has 79. Saturn has more than 30 moons, probably also in the order of 80 or so. We don't know exactly. And Uranus and Neptune also have many moons too. So Earth is actually the only planet in our solar system that has exactly 1 moon. And now we are doing something that makes Earth very sad. We take the moon away. And so what would Earth actually be without a moon? And there are many different questions we can ask. Would Earth as a planet have evolved differently? Would biology have been evolving differently without a moon? And then the next question is, would we, Homo sapiens, have evolved differently? Would we be very different from living on a planet with no moon? And also, to what extent is our perception of the world impacted by not having just one body in the sky, one big body, but we having 2 in the sky? And would our perception of the world be very different? So first of all, let me talk about the planet. Earth's rotation without a moon. We need to understand that initially the rotation was very fast. The length of the day 2 to 3 billion years ago was on the order of only 5 hours. So the Earth was rotating really, really fast. The length of the day today on Earth without moon would be slightly longer, because there are some process in the Earth and the tidal forces from the sun. All of this would slow down rotation a little bit, but it would probably be on the order of 6 to 7 hours. I have not seen anybody doing a study. Earth without moon, what would it be, the rotation today? We only did studies about the Earth with moon and how it impacted the rotation. So we have the situation that 2 to 3 billion years ago, most likely Earth got in the situation that a moon was either captured or it was thrown out of Earth. We don't exactly know how the moon came to be existent. We know that it had to be at a distance that is at least close to 3 Earth radius, because otherwise it would have merged with the Earth. The tides were very large, and they can well have exceeded something like 100 meters, 300 feet. And the day was on the order of 5 hours, very, very short days. And today we are in a situation that the length of day is 24 hours. The tides are on the order of 1 meter in most places, except for some dynamic resonances in some places. And the moon has moved away now to more than or approximately 60 Earth radius. And with the moon being present, this will continue. And in a few billion years from now, the length of the day will be very long, 1,200 hours, 50 days. And the lunar tides will be basically 0. There will be only the solar tides left. So what we have is a situation, we have a moon right now, and I have to talk a little bit about the moon, even if this is Earth without moon. So what we have right now is we have a situation where the Earth and the moon revolve around the center of mass of the system. And this center of mass is currently still inside of the Earth. The moon does this revolution in 27.3 days, and Earth does it as well in 27.3 days. But in addition to making this rotation, the Earth is also spinning very fast. The moon is tidally locked, and that means that the moon is a little bit longer in the direction towards the Earth, cannot rotate with respect to the Earth. And so we always see the same side of the moon. We cannot see the back side of the moon. And Earth is still revolving much faster in one day, rotating much faster in one day. And that leads then on Earth to the tides that we see in the ocean and in the Earth. And in a billion years from now, several billion years from now, we will have the moon and the Earth rotating or revolving around the center of mass in 50 days. Both of them are tidally locked now. We will only be able to see the moon on one side of the Earth. And from the moon, we will only see one side of the Earth, in the same way as we can only see one side of the moon. So that's for Earth with the moon. But now going back to Earth without moon. So what would be the ocean tides be? First of all, they would be much smaller. They would only be caused by the sun. They would be extremely regular. There would be no change. It would be always the same. There would be no fortnightly and monthly variation in the tides. And in the far distant past, the ocean tides were much larger than they were today because of the moon. That would not have happened if the moon would not have been there. And that means that the tidal zones without the moon would have been much narrower. What you see here in these pictures are kind of very, very large areas where the tides are moving, and the tides are causing a huge amount of benefits for the ecological systems in the coastal zone. That would not have happened if there was no moon. And in addition, nocturnal animals would only have seen the same low tide all the night. And the day active animals would always see the same high tide. So there would be no change, and they would all live in a kind of high tide, low tide, dark, light. And the nights without a moon, the night on Earth without a moon would be very dark all the time. For example, turtles, they need light sources to reach the ocean. They need the shining moon on the ocean to actually then be able to find the ocean in the night. When we look at the nights on Earth without moon for prey, lions are much more efficient in the dark nights. So prey would have had a big problem to actually survive the dark nights. And we should not forget that humans were prey for a long time. Homo sapiens were prey, and they must have loved the night with full moon, because that were the nights when they were a little bit safer than in the dark nights. And that may explain why we actually have this appreciation to the full moon nights. They are just safer. Even today, they are safer for us when we are out in the night because we can see. And when you are really in an area where there's very little street light, you really appreciate the full moon nights, because you can walk home in the night and there's enough light for that. And then, of course, for Homo sapiens, there's the female cycle. Charlotte, do you want to talk about it? Because I think a woman can much better talk about that than me.
Sure. You know, when we were brainstorming all of this, I said, well, Hans Peter, there's one thing you haven't discussed yet, and it's a pretty important one for all the women out there. I can speak, I think, openly about this, that the moon and the tides tug very strongly on female cycles. And there's been books written about it, and the red tent, it's a real thing. It's a true phenomena. Without that, we would not have any regularity. So thank you. Thank you, Moon.
Okay. And then, of course, when we look at humanity and our development, then we can really see that the moon is actually everywhere. I was really surprised when I started to research for this presentation that the moon is in everything. And it's not just in mythology and in culture, it's also in science and technology, it's in society itself. And one of the things that may explain this is that some people say that humans became humans because we were able to use fire to cook our food, and with fire and cooked food, we had more energy that we could bring into our body. We could develop larger brains and reason. But then Yuval Harari brings up the importance of stories for human beings. We became the social being that we are because we are revolving around telling stories, convincing people to believe them. So stories are very important. We have a whole ecosystem of myth and stories. And in many of those ecosystems of myth, the moon is everywhere. When you look into the world, everything is full of the moon. This is, for example, when we start with the Egyptians, many of the moon deities were male and female. They had very many of them. I'm just mentioning one here, the moon itself, and then the new moon was another, the full moon was another, and then you can go on with many others. The tribe, the Dahomey tribe in Africa actually says the moon created the world. And when the moon was done with creating the world, it went up into the space. The female moon went into the space and save on heaven and watching its creation. Japanese, the moon is male. And in this case, of course, there is also a female sun. They are their brother and sister. We can go on with the Greek, where they first had Helio and Selene associated with sun and moon, and then Apollo and Artemis came in. And the Aztecs had a sun that was male and a moon that was female. So the gender is changing a little bit from culture to culture. When you go to the Norse mythology, the sun is again female and the moon is male. They form again sister and brother pair. And in most cases, they think that they are both on a chariot that is being pulled through the sky. And this idea is also found in other parts of Europe. It's not just in the Northern Hemisphere. So we see the moon is everywhere, and without a moon, who would have been there a rich diversity of gods, or would we have only been overpowered by the sun as a superpower? Would we really have been able to see that there is so much more than just one big thing on the sky? It's an interesting question to ask. And then, of course, the year is very long. It has 365, 366 days. And if you only have the day and night, how do you separate the year? How do you know which part of the year you actually are in? And when you look into the history, almost every culture has used in the calendar the moon, the months, to define a separation of the year. It's for the Nordic culture here. The historic Celtic holiday was based on the moon. The Germanic calendar was based on the moon. And when we go back to the Babylonian and Chinese calendar, they had a cycle of 19 years that were basically 12 months. But then they realized if we do 12 months based on the lunar cycle, then we are very soon away from the seasonal cycle. So they inserted 7 additional months in these 19 years. The 3rd year, the 6th year, the 8th, and so on, had a leap months inside of them. And so they kept the calendar in synchronization with the seasonal cycle. The Hindu calendar did something similar, the Tibetan, the Islamic calendar. And then when you go to Jewish and Christianity, then many of the holidays are based on the calendar. The moon determines the time of the time Easter will occur. And the holidays are depending on when Easter is. So all of this depends on the moon. Without the moon, how would we actually have been able to get through the year and find out when do we need to harvest, when do we need to move? And I even started to think maybe we are not the only animal that uses the moon. Maybe the migrating bird actually decide based on the moon phase that it's time to go from the one place to the other. I've never thought about it, and I don't think anybody has done research about it, but maybe they are as smart as we were using the moon for timekeeping. And then, of course, even today, there are many, many festivals that are taking place because of the moon. This is an example, the Mid-Autumn Festival. And I find it very interesting that sometimes they use a big moon and the moon escapes. And by the way, I'm very glad our moon here, when we had the Museum of the Moon, didn't escape.
That would have been interesting, Hans Peter. I mean, to see it roll down Hampton Boulevard, actually.
And even today, many, many people among us are deciding based on what the moon is doing. One example is that this movement for gardening by the moon is getting more and more people to follow. There are big groups that are following, in their gardening, the moon phases. I was recently in a place where some of the people were obviously following this, and I said, I'm going to plant some plants tomorrow. And they said, no, you can't do that. You have to wait until after the full moon. You cannot really plant. And so we are still connected very strongly to the moon. And then in the language, it's amazing when you look into the language. I just collected a few idioms here. Even, there were some words that are being used in daily speaking. What is interesting is that they always refer to something that is far away, far above. It can be also very much, and it is inaccessible. So this is something that seems to be very good to use the moon for expressing this. I looked at the ones in German, and again, we have the same situation that in German, based on the moon being far away, the idioms come, and the inaccessibility, wishing for something, or trying to reach the moon, trying to get the moon, is an indication that you are trying to do something that's basically not possible. And there's also a lot of emotion connected to the moon. These are just a few terms from different languages that refer directly to the moon. And of course, when we go into the theater and literature, there is so much that is connected to the moon. And I wouldn't have time to go through all of this. So I just take the example of Shakespeare and the moon. And because of the tides, Shakespeare sees the moon very often associated with water and sea. Because of the enormous influence it has on the ocean, he sees it as a symbol for overwhelming power. But he also thinks that it's a kind of a changeability and fickleness in the moon because of the changing phases, and because it is kind of an error in the orbit. The ellipticity is an error for Shakespeare, and that's why he thinks it has to be connected with madness. The lunatic is something that comes here to mind. But on the other hand, if you are born under the influence of the moon, then it seems to be making you emotionally calm and stable in Shakespeare's document, or in Shakespeare's writing. And then the solar eclipses that are caused by the moon are something that Shakespeare takes as an indication that now times are going to be bad, times are going to be evil, there is a disjoint in nature. So it is really very strongly, and again, what symbols would have been used in theater and in literature if Earth was without the moon? An interesting question. I'm not sure what humans would have come up with if they would not have had the moon to connect all of this to. And then, of course, looking into music, classical music is full of songs focusing on the moon, on the moonlight, and on the emotions that it might bring to us. In modern music, there's so much that is directly related to the moon. I remember when, for example, Police was having this song, Walking on the Moon. It was something that really triggered me as a very interesting song. And there are many of them. And our culture is full of reference to the moon. Even when we go to movies, there are movies where people imagined that we would be on the moon and something would go wrong, Space 1999. And even this new moon in 2021, Moonfall, where moon is being pushed out of his orbit around the Earth and is falling towards Earth. And emotions again and again play a role where moon is the key to the emotion. Moonstruck is a beautiful movie in this respect. And then, of course, there's the art, Peter. And then I think it's your turn now. You unmute. Do you need to unmute?
Yeah. Thanks. That was very interesting. So many things to consider, from that, even just length of days and other, purely pragmatic perspectives related to, life forms and biology. And of course, how that, our biology naturally flows into or plays into our own culture and how we navigate the world. What you were saying about moonlight and how we felt more comfortable on nights when there's a full moon. I mean, there's always everything looks very strange while also familiar when bathed in moonlight. And since so much of creativity is a form of making strange or involves some kind of defamiliarization, Perhaps moonlight may be one of the first, triggers for creative activity. Also, the moon is, let's just go to the first slide that you have thanks. The moon is the only celestial body that we can see, where we can see the features of its surface from Earth without even a telescope. And so this makes the idea of a world beyond our world, or a life beyond this one, possible to imagine. Would we have imagined the notion of heaven, earth, or any kind of afterlife, or even imagined other worlds like we do in science fiction if we didn't have a moon? You can see Venus and Mars and other planets from Earth, but we can't really see their features. So it's very difficult for us to imagine other things living there or some other worlds apart from this one. And the moon, for that reason, has also always symbolized the relationship between what can be seen and not reached, and that possibility of attainment and how it relates to the unattainable. Plato believed that our eyes actually projected what we saw onto the world, rather than the way we know our eyes actually work, where we absorb, light and see things. The eyes are receptors. And so it's a completely incorrect understanding of how vision works, but it's a very interesting thing to consider, because the moon is this celestial body onto which we project all kinds of dreams and other things that we imagine. The image here by Leandro Katz, he's a conceptual artist based in Argentina, is called Lunar Alphabet. And I wanted to include it because the phases of the moon may have actually been the first, not just the first calendar, as Hans Feder mentioned, but in a sense, the first alphabet, the first numerical system. And what ultimately sets us apart from other animals is not really our ability to reason or our use of tools, because we know now that other animals can do that, but our creation and use of symbols. And so numbers, letters are symbols, and of course, images are symbols. Let's go to the next image. This is a great example. This piece is a permanent installation at the Freer Sackler up in DC along the mall, if you ever get the chance to see it. It's based on this Chinese and Japanese fable of a group of monkeys seeing that the moon has fallen into the water, when of course they're actually seeing its reflection. And so we all need to team up and scoop the moon out of the water and put it back in the sky. Just go to the next image. And so what we see here are all words for monkey in many different languages, everything from Italian, Korean, Chinese, and they're actually made in metal and strung together like a chain, going from the skylight at the top of the museum all the way through the stairwell to the very bottom to this body of water, the small reflecting pool. And so it's really interesting because the moon itself is already a reflection. But just go to the next slide for a minute. And what Zhu Bing was also doing with this piece is not just this modern interpretation of that fable. You see an older illustration of it on the left, but it's inevitably related to that game many of us played with when we were little called Barrel of Monkeys, where the monkeys all connect, arm in arm, like a string, like chains in a link, or links in a chain rather. I'll go to the next slide for a minute. And this also just one of my favorite pieces by Nam June Paik, who's well represented at the Chrysler. Some of you probably have seen his work there. And this piece is titled "The Moon is the Oldest TV." It's TV and other media we have today are in their own way mirrors of our culture and of our society. And so this isn't actually an image of the moon. It's electronically altered old cathode ray, tube monitor to resemble the moon. What I wanted to do is share with everyone images other than the very first one we saw that hint at the moon without actually showing the moon. And I think most of these pieces, or I at least hope, would have been created even if we didn't have a moon, to inspire it. Just go to the next piece. This, and then maybe we'll jump to the next one. This is a piece called the, not technically a sculpture, but somewhere between art and science. It was discovered in a shipwreck in the early 20th century, not far from Crete in the Mediterranean, near the island of Antikythera, which is why it's called the Antikythera mechanism. These heavily decayed and oxidized chunks of metal were eventually X-rayed to reveal that they were a mechanism which has been reconstructed. That's what the image we're looking at now. And from the gear ratios, they were able to determine that this was a mechanism for tracking the movements of the moon, and probably for other planets as well. But what Hans-Peter was saying earlier about the balance between simplicity and complexity, if everything was too complex, if there were too many moons in the sky, we probably wouldn't bother to try to figure it out or predict its movements. If it was too simple, we probably wouldn't either. And that you could almost say that mechanical inventions, the mechanization of either clocks and timepieces or other machinery that developed later, may have in fact been inspired by some way of tracking the moon. I'll just go to the next image. Any of the medieval clocks, these are two here, one in Prague and the other at the Strasbourg, the cathedral in Strasbourg rather. These kinds of clocks were not really, they weren't really for telling time. In fact, they didn't tell time very accurately at all. But in the Middle Ages, there wasn't really a need to tell time accurately the way we do now. There wasn't any international travel or anything like that. And so the ornateness of these constructions, and especially with the different phases and the zodiac, it was really this mechanical compilation of symbols. And it was this desire in medieval culture to have a working model of the heavens or of the cosmos. Now let's just go to the next image. Here again, not lunar per se, but Caspar David Friedrich, the German romantic painter, who did some beautiful moonscapes and beautiful landscapes of trees and other features silhouetted by the moon. In this piece, the moon is sort of hinted at the upper part of the picture. You get the sense that there's moonlight in that upper part of the painting, but this was inspired by the space exploration before actual space exploration. The very first expeditions to the North Pole were happening in Europe at the time. And Friedrich did this painting imagining what did the Arctic Circle, what did the North Pole actually look like? He had no way of getting up there himself. And so this is what he imagined that polar, in a sense, pre-lunar landscape resembles. Now let's go to the next image. This is a piece by the Chinese artist Zhu Zhen, I think I'm pronouncing his name correctly, and it was at the James Cohen Gallery in 2008. When you walked into the gallery, you saw this table with a small microscope, and if you go to the next image, you can see you were able to go up and sit at the microscope and look in, and what you saw when you looked in is in the next image. A small microscopic chunk of sand, or actually it was a small bit of mud, and a microscopic footprint embedded in it that you could only see, by looking through the scope. And so this miniaturization of that famous footprint that we've all seen images of, the first footprint on the moon. The two frontiers of science, you could say, are the exploration of that which is infinitely small and the infinitely large. The Hubble telescope or any of those probes we're sending to other parts of the galaxy or beyond the solar system. And then, of course, the infinitely, the infinitely large and the infinitely small, telescopes, microscopes. Those are really the two frontiers. If we had never actually gotten to the moon, we probably would have, or if we had, let's say, if we had to fake our trip to the moon, we probably would have hired Georges Méliès, the filmmaker who was responsible for the Voyage dans la Lune, probably generally credited with being the first science fiction movie from 1902. He was an illusionist and a magician who eventually went into filmmaking. And if we go to the next image, another still from the movie, what's interesting is about the rocket ship that depicted in the film is how it resembles the telescope. What we can reach visually and what we can actually reach physically is implied in this. I don't think he did it deliberately. It was just, trying to, obviously, in a sense, he was imagining what a rocket might look like before even the invention of rockets. But like I said, if we had been compelled to somehow fake the lunar landing, we would have hired Méliès to pull it off for us. Let's just run to the next slide. This is a portrait of Joseph Cornell, looking very lunar here, although not literally under moonlight. Cornell was a collage artist who made these beautiful shadow box constructions. We'll go to see one on the next slide. Many of them did depict the moon literally, but this one I wanted to include because it's a beautiful hinting at the moon. In the lower right, we see small blue glass marbles inside of a small, like cocktail glass. And then in the upper left, a cork ball painted blue, not literally depicting the moon, but strongly resembling the moon. In fact, this piece is kinetic. The ball in the upper left rests on two metal bars. So if you move the box, it rolls from one side to the other. So it does have some movement. Let's go to the next slide. The Japanese photographer Hiroshi Sugimoto shot this. It was a time exposure, I think about 2, maybe even as long as 3 hours. The Pantheon in Rome is one of the oldest buildings in Rome, dating back to the Roman Empire. And the dome of its interior has an oculus, or this open to the air skylight in the middle. And he shot this under a full moon. And so the entire illuminated interior we're seeing is only by moonlight. Okay, yeah, we can go to the next slide. And then this wonderful sculpture, it's about 3 feet in diameter by the New York-based artist Jackie Windsor. It's called Blue Hemisphere. Again, not literally depicting the moon, but strongly hinting at the moon with this beautiful chalky blue interior, and then the concrete relief on the exterior. We, of course, know if we slice the moon in half, it wouldn't really look like this, but you can almost imagine it would. And then I think I just have one more slide to share with you tonight. This was from the Apollo 17 mission, the last time that the NASA went to the moon. And this was taken by Gene Cernan, who was the last person to walk on the moon. Just a view of Earth with this lunar rock in the foreground on the surface. So that's what I have to share with everyone. Are there any questions for me or Hans-Peter?
Well, we can continue. I have a few more slides to talk about the science and the technology, and then we can go back and we can then ask the questions or have questions.
This might be a good time to mention to everybody and remind them that there is a Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And if you'd like to ask some questions of the duo, we will pose them back to them momentarily.
So I would like to spend a short time on science and technology. Because when we look at knowledge that we have created, one of the knowledge that was very interesting for human beings was to understand what is actually the rigidity of the solid Earth. And in the late 1800s, several scientists, including Darwin and Kelvin and Newcomb, they used basically the difference of the fortnightly ocean tides and the computed equilibrium ocean tides to say the difference must come from the Earth being deformed by the tidal forces, the solid Earth being deformed. And based on the difference that they could get from the tide gauges, they measured the ocean tides, and then they computed the equilibrium ocean tides. They could come to the conclusion that the rigidity of the Earth on average exceeds that of steel. That was a very important information for understanding how the Earth is behaving as a solid body and as a planet. Another one is, of course, and Peter mentioned that already, it would probably never have happened that we had tried to get out in space and to get to another body in space if Moon would not have been around. And I'm asking myself sometimes, what would have been the competition between the countries, the United States and Russia, if they would not have competed for the space? Maybe they would have done something else that would probably not have been as positive as the space race was, because the space race itself had a number of technology spins-off. I'm listening here, just a few, the smoke detectors that we have now in our houses to make sure that if a fire starts is something that was developed. The joystick, computer mouse, 3D graphics, and you can go into many of those things that came out of the competition to get to the moon and to be on the moon first.
We'd both be just putting more dogs into space like the Russians did, probably.
Would a space race have taken place without the moon as a reachable goal? Even considering that it's far away, it was not so far away that we could say there's no way to reach it.
Yeah, yeah, you're right. If it was Mars or something, we just couldn't,
yeah, we still, have problems to get there. And then the question is, what would the competition between countries have to evolved into something that would not have been as nice and positive for humanity as a space race? I mentioned the length of the day. We would never have been able to understand how the day is changing without having observations of solar eclipses that were noted by people over 2,500 years. So scientists went into the documentation that was collected by all those cultures who were interested in the eclipses, because solar eclipses were something that impacted people very much. And then when you looked at those solar eclipses and you used models to compute when those should have happened, we discovered that there was a time difference. And this time difference could only be explained by the length of day changing. And with space geodetic observations, of course, we were much more, we had much more tools to actually find out that the length of day is changing by 2.3 milliseconds per day. That means over 1,000 days, we get 2.3 seconds. And that means we have to put in some leap seconds to make sure that the rotation time, the time based on the rotation of the Earth, is not running away from the time based on atomic clocks. And most of this is caused by tidal friction, but not all of it. So we would still have length of day changes if there was no moon. It would be much smaller, and most likely human beings would not really be able to detect them. And then, of course, Peter mentioned that we were that humans were able going to the moon. And what they did, Apollo 11 already left some retroreflectors on the moon, and that allowed us to do laser ranging, lunar laser ranging, to get an idea of how the moon is moving away from us. And based on the laser ranging, we know now that the moon is spiraling away from Earth at the rate of something like 3.8 centimeters per year. I mentioned that eventually it will be far away from us, but currently it's only 3.8 centimeters per year that it's moving away because of tidal frictions, because of the change of angular momentum and the rotation of the Earth-Moon system. So without a moon, we would not have discovered these small changes in the length of day. They would have been much smaller, and we would not have understood whether our clocks are not working correctly or whether the length of day is really changing. And even today, this is very interesting, October 14, 2021, it was published that the light that the moon is reflecting, and that is light that comes from Earth. So the Earth reflects light. This light goes to the moon, and then it comes back from the moon when the moon is, when we see the moon is not having a lot of light from the sun. And we can use this to detect that the light that is coming from the Earth, reflected from the Earth, is slowly getting less because there's more carbon dioxide, greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and the albedo of the planet is changing. So all of this is something that we would not be able to do without a moon. And then, of course, in business, many people use the name moon in one or another way. And I was able to ask him.
My name is Bernardo. I am the innkeeper of La Luna. Welcome to our gorgeous place, even if today it's a little bit cloudy. Right, I was asked why we call this place La Luna. The first thing I was thinking, why not? At the time, 22 years ago, there was no many places called La Luna. And today there are maybe 15, 20 hotels that have this name. But at the time we were the only one. But there is a story behind this because we were watching the America's Cup many years ago when Prada launched La Luna Rossa, the first time he was racing with this boat. And he was in New York, he was at very late at night, and we were scrambling with the idea for the name of this resort. And my friend told me, why don't you call Luna Rossa? It's a nice name. And I immediately say, okay, Prada will sue us for sure. But after he wrote, he asked me, what is the name of the moon in Italian. I say La Luna. And he wrote La Luna on a piece of paper. He did a little bit of a logo. And I immediately told him, no, look, La Luna in Italian, it's the two words, La Luna. He told me, no, you don't understand. This is the name of your hotel. I put the paper in my pocket. We watched the regatta. The day after, when I went home, I saw the piece of paper and I said, yes, this is the name. And this guy is a famous designer in New York. He's a Japanese guy named Yoshimi Kono. And thank you, Yoshimi, for the name.
We go to some of the questions in the, there are some questions I see in the Q&A.
Yeah. Well, I have two more slides, and then we can go to the questions. You know, first of all, what our perception, and you mentioned that already, Peter, a planet without moons would be very regular. Everything would be connected to one of their days on this planet. So the worldview would probably be everything is regular, periodic, and we cannot deviate from regularity. We have to be always regular and periodic. And if we would live on a planet with many moons, it would be extremely complex, and it would appear very chaotic. And I think the worldview of people living on a planet with many moons, or animals living on a planet with many moons, would be that everything is chaotic. Nothing can be predicted. Nothing can be controlled. Everything comes without being expected. And only on planets with one moon, we have a discernible regularity that is overlain by another regularity. And so the worldview is basically, we can make sense of the world. It's not too complex. It's difficult to understand, but it's not too complex. So I think we would have a very different perception on an Earth without moon. And finally, we can ask, would aliens from other planets with no moon or many moons perceive the world as we do? So if they would come and visit us, would they really have the same way of looking at the world as we do? And Peter, I think you like to mention that we would invite them to stay at the moon and not come to planet Earth and use the moon as a guest house. And I think that's the end of our thinking about Earth without moon.
Well, yeah, I'm kind of wondering what will happen to the moon when it does eventually drift away. I guess it'll go in a museum. You know,
We'll take it. This is fascinating, guys. There is a lot of great questions here, and please keep them coming. The first question is, how do we know the moon is moving away from us? How are we able, and you sort of answered that later on, is it because of the laser that is that part of the way that we've been able to understand that it's moving away?
Yes. The laser ranging, the lunar laser ranging gave us the real measurement that shows us the moon is actually oscillating a little bit around a mean distance, but then there is a trend. And our measurements are really showing what this trend is.
Okay. The next, sorry.
It was only possible because we have the lunar reflectors on the moon.
Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't know that until this discussion, that we were able to track it that way. How do you construct a study about animals and how they use the moon? I mean, I think there's a lot of different ways that probably people could do this. I know you mentioned you're not sure if anybody's done it before, and I kind of wonder somebody must have.
well, yeah, with the turtles that you mentioned, I mean, they, you know, if they hatch at night and it's totally dark.
Yep.
You know that.
Well, I personally came up with this question, I think 3 hours ago. So I haven't really had time to think about how I would do an experiment. But I think, you know, we never thought about that. But human beings, Homo sapiens, started to use the moon to do timekeeping throughout the year. And why would other animals not have done that?
Yeah, they must. I mean, there's flowers that only blossom at a full moon. Like, there, you know, we didn't even go into the botany. There's all kinds of opportunity here, I think. This is a fascinating subject matter. It's interesting once you go into it, you see it everywhere. So this is a heavy question. So we're so influenced in so many ways by the moon. Is it reciprocal with all that we have done to our environment here on Earth? Does that influence in any way negatively the moon's atmosphere, or do we even know?
Well, there's no atmosphere on the moon. So, but obviously what is happening is that less light is coming back from Earth. So the dark side of the moon is getting less light from Earth. So Earth looks dimmer if you are on Moon, but there is nobody on Moon to see it. So maybe we would see it if we have a space base on Moon.
Okay. How would navigation be different, and how might those changes have affected early civilizations? That's a hard one to unpack for sure. I mean, we've used it as a, we talk about it, how it's such an important mechanism to keep time as well as to navigate. I can't imagine how we would have navigated.
Used as much for navigation. I mean, normally like a sextant, you use the sun, or of course we use the stars. And, like the North Star is not true north anymore. It moves over, very slowly, but it does.
And the changes in the length of day, the big ones from 5 hours to whatever, is over billions of years. So at the time of the dinosaurs, it was already 21 hours, and the time when Homo started to come around, it was close to 24 hours. It was probably a little bit less than 24 hours, but not much. We have to really see the timescales that we are around is very, very short compared to the long history of the planet. We are, and Homo sapiens is even shorter.
Yeah, it's good to put that in perspective. So this is a question: if Theia had not impacted Earth, do you believe that Earth may have gotten a moon in some other way?
Well, this is a question that's very difficult to answer because we don't know exactly. There are at least 4 or 5 reasonable theories how we actually got a moon. And we don't know why we have a moon. And so it's very difficult to answer that question. If we wouldn't have a moon, whether it would have been something else that came. The theories all make sense, but we have not really understood where the moon came from.
Yeah. Next question, and this is a hard one. Again, I think a lot of this stuff is some of this is just asking and we don't know, we're pontificating here, but what would that mean for the flora and fauna once the moon moves further away over time? Do we have any sense of how that might affect us?
Well, I think that the main thing that will affect us is that the sun is going to change and get less and less and less. And when we are so far away from, when the moon is so far away from the Earth and the days are 1,200 hours long, the sun is the biggest problem that we have to worry about. I mean, we won't be around anymore, but I think that most of the life on Earth has been able to adjust to the changes in the length of day, and I think that as long as the sun is giving enough light for life to continue, the length of the day will not change to an extent that life would not be able to live with it. I think, for example, trees have no problems with longer days. Their time scale is very different, and I think animals like us would be able to adapt to this, even when it goes to 25 hours, 28 hours, or even 40 hours, which is very, very far in the future.
And in the end, it's also a very gradual change.
Yeah.
I mean, part of the problem with a lot of the environmental changes from human activity is the fact that they're so comparatively abrupt.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's actually perfect, because the final question says, would we be able to evolve with these changes? And you guys have already addressed that. It seems like hopefully we're a very adaptable.
It is extremely slow, these changes, and that's why it is interesting to ask what would it be if we were on a planet without a moon. And for me, the most interesting question is actually if aliens would come from a planet without moon. Would they think that we are far too diverse and too irregular for their taste? They would probably consider us as chaotic. And if they come from a planet with a huge amount of moons, they would probably think that we are really boring, because we are so relatively regular. There is a little bit of irregularity, but it's not chaotic. We don't like to be chaotic.
No, we like to have organization. We like taxonomy here. Okay, so here's a fun one. This is a personal question for both of you. What is your favorite moon-related artwork, movie, or song?
I don't know.
And while you're thinking about it, I'll mention that in the chat, we did share the Barry Art Museum's playlist, Moon's playlist. We had a lot of fun making a Spotify list with all of our favorite moons.
I would probably have to say the, you know, and this might seem totally obvious, but the Moonlight Sonata.
Yeah.
And not just that it's a beautiful piece, but like we were saying in one of our earlier discussions, if you had to describe moonlight to someone who could not see, what better thing but that piece, which ironically was written by someone who couldn't hear.
Mm.
Right.
So, you know, Moonlight, for people who can't see, written by a composer who was, well, it was at least going deaf, you know, at that time.
Yeah. And I would agree with you, Peter, because not just because of the music, but also because in general, I really love the music that Beethoven wrote, and I'm very comfortable with that. And in terms of the movie related to the moon, I think Moonstruck would be not just because of the emotions and the personal relationship, but also the food that is in this movie. You know, that would be my favorite one. I think I need to watch it again.
Wonderful. Well, guys, thank you both so much. This has been fascinating. And Hans-Peter, I hope you do write the book. I know you're already thinking about it.
You know, we have never really thought about that before you brought in the moon. I'm glad, as I said, the moon didn't escape here and roll down Hampton Boulevard. But I think
that was a knockoff moon, I should say. That was a Chinese moon, just so you know.
Yeah.
That was not Luke Jerram's moon that rolled down the street. I should say.
It really stimulated me thinking, you know, because I think we underestimate how important it is to realize that our perception is not the real world, but it is the perception of something that we imagine to be the world. And this is determined by all the stories that we have. And all the stories we have come from this dual system. Maybe in philosophy, we would never have talked about dual worlds. Yin and yang may not exist if we were on a planet with only a sun. Nobody would have probably thought about yin and yang. And so I think that we have something to think about that maybe in a book could be very nicely expressed.
Agreed.
Okay.
Well, thank you all. I'm going to bid you guys for now farewell with a couple upcoming things that are happening at the Barry Art Museum. If this wasn't spooky enough for you, we do have a trick or treat in the galleries this weekend, Saturday and Sunday. It's going to be really fun. We have haunting music and some really fun spooky tours happening. They're free at 1 o'clock. Next week, I can't believe it's already here because this one was rescheduled. We have another lecture. It's next Thursday, November 4th. And it's called On Passing Time and Rising Tides, Engaging on Resilience in Tidewater and Beyond. This is thinking about how the moon pulls and tugs on the tides right here in Hampton Roads. And so we'll be speaking with different environmentalists as well as photographers and artists that have been documenting this process. Coming up in just a couple weeks, we have our very first Unite. So this is a really exciting new program, the second Friday of every month. We're inviting people to come in for a cash bar and for food and beverage. And our first one is about fashion. So we have a fashion show with ODU fashion merchandising students, as well as the Governor's School for the Arts students. It'll be fabulous. And then our next lecture after that is December 2nd. And this is one where we're switching gears a little bit to think a bit more about our Karen Lamont exhibit. And it is a discussion exploring the phenomena of self-sexualization and self-empowerment and the psychology around these philosophical shifts in culture of our times. Finally, thank you all so much for attending tonight. It's been wonderful to be here. We hope you have a great night and go do some moon gazing for all of us. Bye now.